This video is sponsored by Squarespace. The hardest part in analyzing a movie such as Oppenheimer is you can fall victim to trying too hard to find random scenes in the movie to impress upon the viewer that you just know more than he does, with some special insight into what made this innocuous scene special. With Oppenheimer, it feels rather disingenuous to do that, considering how well known and analyzed the film already is. As a favorite to win the Oscar for Best Picture among a host of other nominations, like Cillian Murphy for Best Actor, Robert Downey Jr. for Best Supporting Actor, Emily Blunt for Best Supporting Actress, Best Score, Best Screenplay, Best Director, we all get the point that this is a unique film. So instead of trying to mine too deep into the heart of the mountain that is Oppenheimer and lose perspective, let's take a look at 5 iconic scenes from Oppenheimer and why they make Oppenheimer deserving of a Best Picture nomination. Near the beginning of the film, after we've been introduced to Oppenheimer in an interrogation room and set up Robert Downey Jr.'s Louis Strauss congressional hearing scene, we bounce back in time to a young Oppenheimer. You can tell Christopher Nolan does not want to spend a lot of time in Oppenheimer's past. And honestly, it's for good reason, as there seems to be a lot more controversies surrounding his younger years as to what is or what is not historically accurate. Case in point, the poisoned apple scene. And while Nolan has remarked on making historical films saying we haven't made a documentary, we've made a dramatic interpretation of his life, it's still probably better than, say, Ridley Scott's Napoleon biopic, where he had the maligned general shooting cannonballs at the pyramids because he thought it was funny, I guess. When I have issues with historians, I ask, "Excuse me, mate, were you up there? No? Well then shut the f*** up." This is not the approach Christopher Nolan takes to making historical films, even if he is taking creative liberties on some of the historical elements. This particular scene sets itself up well, getting the sense that Oppenheimer is a bit troubled and lacking a sense of direction from his current studies, which they had previously set up with an older Oppenheimer saying he was
troubled by visions of a hidden universe
that seemed to keep him from sleeping. You quickly find the connection point is from a lecture by Danish physicist Niels Bohr. Now, this is a bit easy to miss watching through the scene, but as Niels Bohr is talking, when Oppenheimer finally gets to the lecture, he says, "Einstein has opened the door. Now we are peering through,
seeing a world inside our world that not everyone can accept."
This is the hidden universe that we see a young Oppenheimer frightened of. The visuals of quantum physics we get are chaotic and uncontrolled. He seems to struggle to understand it, and in terms, it seems to scare him. Fast forward to the night after Niels Bohr's lecture. These visions are a bit more stable, and the shot of Oppenheimer is not of someone that is frightened anymore, but someone that is beginning to perhaps understand it. The next morning, Oppenheimer meets Niels Bohr, and we find out that he had attended his lecture previously at Harvard.
I heard you give the same
At
lecture.
Harvard, yes, and you ask the same question. Why ask again?
I'd like your answer.
Did you like it better yesterday?
A lot.
It's here that we start to connect the dots a bit more on this whole sequence. Like Niels said, Einstein opened the door to a new world that not everyone could accept. And we see that firsthand with Oppenheimer initially in that category until the second lecture when he asked his question again. This time, perhaps a little bit more ready to receive the answer, which gives us this beautiful response that sets up almost the entire film.
You can lift the stone without being ready for the snake that's revealed.
Oppenheimer early on was not ready for the snake underneath the stone, and it foreshadows that he again was not as prepared as he thought he was for lifting the stone on a nuclear weapon.
You could lift the stone without being ready for the snake that's revealed.
But now in this moment, Oppenheimer has accepted this other world that Einstein has cracked the door to and is ready for. Niels tells him to get out of the lab and go to Germany to learn theory and describes algebra as sheet music and gives this meaningful question.
The important thing isn't can you read music, it's can you hear it. Can you hear the music, Robert?
For math in general, this is actually an excellent question. It's one thing as a mathematician to understand every rule and how every equation works, but it's another thing entirely to be able to hold all of the principles and concepts in your head and see how they all connect and work together and think in abstract terms, to see things that others can't. Beyond just reading and memorizing formulas and equations, you have to look much deeper at the structure and have the intuition to visualize beyond it. And this is also what Nolan is signaling to the audience. In no way will any of us come out Nobel Prize winning quantum physicists at the end of this film, but you don't have to be a physicist to understand the beauty and importance of quantum physics. Just the same way you can enjoy an amazing piece of music and experience it fully but have no knowledge of how it works or even be able to play an instrument yourself. Your lack of knowledge should not discourage you from recognizing the beauty of something. And Nolan lets us know it's okay we don't know, but you can still hear the music, right?
Yes, I can.
This launches us into composer Ludwig Göransson's beautiful score, Can You Hear the Music?, which begins with a beautiful running violin, seemingly representative of Oppenheimer slowly discovering and learning about theory, and the slow ticking that continues on to a reported 21 tempo changes in Göransson's 2-minute piece. The ticking helps to almost visualize what is happening within quantum physics, and at the same time the feeling of the inevitable march to war that would begin to speed up in the future with horns blaring, almost as a warning of the destructive nature of what he is discovering. But he still plods forward, this time with a certainty that is different than the first encounter with quantum physics. Instead of chaotic nightmares, there slowly emerges an order to what he is visualizing, until we reach the brief eureka moment where he laughs. All of the visuals and music combined help to give us a sense of quantum physics. We see experimentation, we see equations, we see visualizations of quantum physics, but we also see nature, art, and literature, as well as hinting that Oppenheimer has more to him than just being a physicist. And that's something that plays a major role in the story. But do you know what else has more to it than initially meets the eye? Today's sponsor, Squarespace, with their fluid engine that splits a few atoms of their own, letting you bypass the tedious coding and, constantly saving and checking to see if something looks right. With their fluid engine, you can click, drag, and drop your assets in real time anywhere you want to customize your website to your liking. Are you not the designing type though? That's totally fine. Squarespace has countless templates to choose from and categorized to fit your specific industry, with awesome galleries to show off to prospective clients or fans and a great booking system for your future gigs. Head over right now to squarespace.com/framevoyager to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain by using the code Voyager. Now, back to Oppenheimer. This is where the difficulty begins with the scenes from a Christopher Nolan film, especially this one. They are not linear, and the interrogation scene happens throughout the entirety of the film until almost the very end, meaning that while you do have several defining moments throughout the scene that could be included as their own scenes, they do occur at various points throughout the film. And while they are different scenes entirely within the film, it is hard to not address them as a group in this situation. Nolan mentioned in an interview for this film that he liked to cut back and forth between the various points in time when they evoked the certain feeling or the moment the character was in at that narrative time. And we see that a lot with the cuts to the interrogation room, which you'd think, looking at a script, that this small interrogation room would be pretty dull. But Nolan employs some rather interesting visuals and effects in various parts of the scene. We will quickly touch on the 3 most memorable moments. The first memorable scene from the interrogation room has to be the questioning of Oppenheimer's relationship with Jean Tatlock, and the jarring visuals you get. First, a visual representation of Oppenheimer feeling exposed when they begin questioning him on the relationship, where we see him now sitting in the room without any clothes. And as they push further into this aspect of the interrogation, Jean Tatlock also joins Oppenheimer in the room, visually speaking. It's one of the most visceral images of infidelity you can think of in cinema. It's a painful ordeal for Oppenheimer's wife to have this part of his past brought up again, and it leaves Oppenheimer feeling vulnerable and shameful, exposing a very personal part of his past. And while this is meant to show Oppenheimer essentially being split open for all to see, as Christopher Nolan describes it, it also provides a distinctive character flaw. You're not supposed to be comfortable with the scene. In fact, really none of the intimate scenes in this film are supposed to feel comfortable. With an earlier scene where Tatlock makes him read his famous line, "Now I become death, the destroyer of worlds," and he later repeats this line at the detonation of the nuclear bomb, seemingly getting off to this power trip and god complex he develops during the beginning half of the film, only to have the consequences of his recklessness come back to haunt him and diminish that god complex. He seems to become smaller and weaker in each scene in the interrogation room, and in this case, it's really a result of his own doing. And it's uncomfortable, because it subverts our usual narrative of a heroic antagonist and reminds you of the complicated morality of Oppenheimer's character. This is done intentionally, of course, by the committee, no doubt. to try and put a wedge in between him and his wife, who would defend him in our next top moment. This is where Emily Blunt really gives the performance that would get her a nomination for Best Supporting Actress. It's a really nice scene which shows her outwitting the lawyer for the committee, trying to catch her in a trap during his questioning. This, of course, is a scene that does point out one of the flaws in Oppenheimer and a lot of Christopher Nolan films. He doesn't really give his female characters a lot to do, and really beyond a couple of small moments, this is really the most development of a female character you get in the film, as not a ton of time is devoted to diving too much below the surface on Oppenheimer's many relationships. And while one can see how hard that is to fit into an already 3-hour film, it still does make it an issue within the film. But otherwise, great scene. Lastly, we see an excellent conclusion to the interrogation room in which the pressure gets put on Oppenheimer to explain his conflicting viewpoints on dropping and creating a nuclear weapon, and the contradictions and anxieties about his work that ramp up through the film. They finally reach a climax where he seemingly is confronted by his own demons before finally admitting,
"If we did it, they would have to do it. Our efforts would only fuel their efforts."
This scene really helps us to not fully accept Oppenheimer as a hero or someone that completely was against using the bomb. He was a large part of it, and I think you see the mental gymnastics fall apart for him here, trying to convince even himself that he was always against it. But in a moment of honesty, he answers when he first had a moral issue with using the atomic weapon.
That we would tend to use any weapon we had.
Now I realize how controversial the Trinity test was to a lot of moviegoers. It's a portion of the film that many people point to as being the weakest and most disappointing aspect of the film, mostly because of the size and nature of how they showed the atomic blast. Many thinking and showing how it wasn't even close to the size and scale, and also saying Nolan should have just opted for CGI. While I understand those points, it's still a very well set up scene in the film and a score that makes the tension almost overwhelming. From the reminder that it could blow up the entire planet.
Are we saying there's a chance that when we push that button, we destroy the world?
Or the fact that they had failed a test right beforehand.
Let's go in to tell you the implosion test failed.
The pressures of time from a political perspective.
Don't let them slow us down. We're firing on the 15th.
The 15th.
To hoping they didn't get the wrong measurements about how far away to be.
Are those safe distances?
Based on your calculations.
To the monitoring the readings to make sure they don't have to cancel the test.
If the detonators don't charge or the voltage drops below 1 volt, you hit that button, you abort. Understood?
When the bomb detonates finally, and you're left with absolute silence and quiet breathing, and you finally see the full explosion, which again, whether or not one thinks that the explosion was lacking or not, it's still an impressive setup and tension, and Nolan seemingly leaves you in the silence for an entire minute and 45 seconds, which is almost enough time to ease your anticipation of the explosion that you know is coming. But because the silence goes on for so long, the explosion seems to come out of nowhere, and offbeat almost. The speech scene after they find out that the US has successfully dropped the first atomic bomb is to me more climactic and impactful than the Trinity test or even showing the bombs being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I've heard from some that have issues with that not being shown, and while I can understand that position, this film was written from the perspective of Oppenheimer and what he would have experienced. And as in all good horror movies, sometimes what we don't see is even more horrifying than seeing it in the first place. Another Best Picture nominee, Zone of Interest, takes this approach as well, never showing any of the horrors of Auschwitz, but just the mundane lives of the German captors. All the while, you hear the horrors happening, but completely out of sight for the entire film. Leaving things up to the imagination can be more terrifying, and if Nolan ever wanted to make a straight horror film, he shows you he's got some tricks up his sleeve in this scene. Oppenheimer addresses the residents of Los Alamos as they wave their historically incorrect American flags and cheer on the success of the mission, where he begins to give a speech that seems pretty off from the start. And as it goes on, you can see him almost become horrified of what he is saying. And the eeriest moment of the film kicks in as we hear a young girl scream. And while the clapping continues, you can't hear it. The background begins to shift behind Oppenheimer. He continues his speech. The crowd roars, unheard, only leaving chair movements and rustling. And the visuals that follow representing the flashes of light of an atomic blast, the skin flaying off, and the sudden disappearance of everyone in the room, much like that of those closest to the atomic blast, all begin to bring a sense of reality of what was just theory and science beforehand. They had lifted the rock, and Oppenheimer was not ready for the snake that was underneath it. As he exits the room, we are shown a display of chaotic emotions, the cheering and happiness over the deaths of countless innocent lives, while yet other scientists begin to face the reality of what they had achieved. It's a truly devastating scene and the linchpin for where we begin to see Oppenheimer take a stance against the weapons that would lead him to the interrogation. While the rest of the scenes on this list have very flashy moments, the conversation between Oppenheimer and Einstein at the very beginning and end of the film is one of the best and most satisfying moments. This scene initially sets up Robert Downey Jr.'s Lewis Strauss to get a bit jealous, and early on in the film you don't notice Lewis Strauss talking too much about how Oppenheimer soured Einstein on him. Or at least, that's what he believed happened. But it becomes rather apparent as the film goes on, and really at the end of the film, how much Oppenheimer seems to have gotten into his head, which also reveals how vain of a man Strauss truly is. And we see this right before too.
I chose to sell shoes.
Louis Strauss was once a lowly shoe salesman.
No, just a shoe salesman.
This is a flaw we see in Oppenheimer throughout. His naivety and skill of getting under other people's skin gets him in trouble time and again. But it's with Strauss he really miscalculates and kicks off the vengeance Strauss seeks against Oppenheimer that inevitably brings him to the interrogation room and his moral reckoning. But this leaves us with a question we don't have answered until the end of the film. What did Oppenheimer say to Einstein that upset him? In the end, Strauss is found to be foolish in thinking that it was all about him, and in fact his selfish nature and jealousy are his own undoing. In his last moment of the film, Strauss looks to his aide and tells him again after he loses his cabinet appointment.
I told you, you turned the scientists against me.
Tired of this line of thought, the aide replies,
"Is it possible they didn't talk about you at all?"
And in fact, they were. Einstein paints the future for Oppenheimer on how he will be used and then thrown away, only to be brought back for an award that really wasn't about him, saying now it's his time to deal with the consequences of his achievement. But then, when Oppenheimer finally speaks, we get the line that upsets Einstein. And no, it's nothing political or conniving like Strauss believes it to be. It's a fear of something that transcends any petty politics. It's the reckoning of the snake under the rock, the opening of Pandora's box. As he delivers his line, the camera pans to a pond with rain starting to hit the surface of the water. It's the same as the very first image we are shown in the film, ripples across the water that show up again and again also throughout the film. We have initially equated them with visuals of quantum physics that we are introduced to at the beginning, and while that may very well be what it started out as, it's now turned from a visual of something beautiful into something that could destroy everything.
We thought we might start a chain reaction that would destroy the entire world. I believe we did.
And this is where the film foreshadows a potential future for us. The ripples being nuclear blasts and chain reactions across the world. The reality of an idea that was presented as beautiful, groundbreaking, and a door to a new world has now turned the wonder and excitement of quantum physics in Oppenheimer's life work into something that is truly devastating that leaves him forever haunted. But are you tired of being haunted and having an existential crisis that this film dredges up every time you watch it? Well, you should check out our video on the 5 scenes that make the warm and cozy The Holdovers deserving of a Best Picture nomination right here.